Josh Izenberg is a documentary filmmaker, and his film SLOMO won over a dozen awards, including Best Short Documentary at South by Southwest, and premiered as a New York Times Op Doc and was shortlisted for an Academy Award. Now, his subsequent film, the Netflix original Resurface, won the jury prize at Tribeca and was nominated for an Emmy. He since co-directed the short documentaries Game Hawker for Patagonia Films and Eco-Hack. And we have co-director Brett Marty, who cut his teeth as a commercial director and made the transition to filmmaking with a handful of documentary and narrative shorts, which have won their share of jury awards and played at 100 plus film festivals, including Cannes, and were commissioned by The New Yorker, Patagonia Films, and National Geographic. Now, both have co-directed the Oscar-qualifying short film documentary Eco-Hack, and it follows biologist Tim Shields down an unconventional route to save the desert tortoise. Eco-Hack received its Oscar-qualified status after winning Best Documentary Short at the Palm Springs International Short Fest and HotDocs International in Toronto. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome film directors of Eco-Hack, Josh Izenberg and Brett Marty, to the show. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Well, I'm going to direct this to both of you. So how did you come to learn about Tim Shields' work?
Yeah, go ahead, Brett.
We had an editor that we worked with named Key Haywood for years, and he mentioned one day that back when he was in high school, this quirky figure came to his classroom in a toga to talk about his work in the Mojave. And now that he's up to a bunch of strange things in the desert involving lasers and drones and exploding tortoiseshells, and Josh and I were both just kind of looked at each other and like, oh, we got to meet this guy. So next time he was in town, we had lunch and kind of got an update on everything he was working on and how it worked and why.
Well, what intrigued both of you about Tim's passion and dedication to saving the desert tortoise?
Brett and I have been interested in conservation and issues around biodiversity and biodiversity loss for a long time. And, I personally have been in love with animals since I was a kid. The desert tortoise is an extremely charismatic creature, really kind of drives imagination. This giant tortoise wandering around the desert, very interesting and appealing animal. And Tim has been out there with these desert tortoises for 30 years. He's like the, sort of the Jane Goodall of the desert tortoise in a way. And it's his passion and interest in trying to find a way to save these animals is palpable. I mean, you could really feel it with him. And, when we find a character as passionate as Tim, we just team up with them, train our cameras on that person and hang on. And that's what we did.
How long did it take you to film Eco-Hack?
It was about 2 years. We've been following his work while it developed over the years. And then once it got to a point just before the pandemic, actually, it was like, oh, Tim's really hitting his stride. He's taking these tools like beyond just testing. And now he's actually getting them out in the wild and seeing how they work. And so we started filming, I think, February 2020, and then wrapped up the filming kind of mid to late 2021 and then started editing.
Now, normally when I'm talking to directors of, let's say, short films as an example, I'm hearing timelines between 3, 4, maybe 5, maybe 6 days to film the short. Because this is a documentary on a reptile, the desert tortoise, is one reason why it took so long to film and put this together?
A couple of things to that. I mean, one, as documentary filmmakers, even with shorts, these things take time. These stories unfold slowly. We have to repeatedly check back in with our subjects. And that time creates an expansiveness and it lets you kind of tell the whole story. And the science that Tim was working on takes time too. Like over the course of filming, he developed and deployed multiple tools. They perfected their laser. They were working on this fake exploding tortoiseshell. So like between when we started and 2 years later when we wrapped up, things had just come such a long way. So I don't think we could have done this in a week. COVID, obviously, we started in 2020, so that set us back a bit, and that added a certain amount of time to it. But typically, Brett and I take our time with these films. I think like the probably a year would be the quickest documentary production window for a short that we've worked on so far. So this was not unusual in that regard.
Well, why should the general population care about the desert tortoise?
Well, I think it's one species that's suffering from climate change, just like so many different ecosystems around the world, and it's just indicative of what's happening to that particular ecosystem. And what really drew us to Tim is he's able to connect that species of tortoise to the larger problem and his new take on conservation, which is that we've pushed the planet so far to the brink that if we don't put our hands on the levers of the ecosystem itself, it's going to be a pretty lonely planet.
When I watched the film, I was intrigued because I love documentaries when it comes to nature and animal life, and in this case, a reptile that has an average lifespan between 30 to 50 years, where some desert tortoises have been known to live as long as 80 years, comparing that to the giant tortoise, which we know can live upwards to 200 plus years. And so I was very intrigued because normally in nature, there's just this normal life cycle. But with the desert tortoise, it seems like their life cycle has become extremely short because what is it, the overpopulation of the raven?
That's right. I mean, the issue that the tortoises are facing right now, they face a lot of issues, but the issue that Tim is addressing in the film is this overpopulation of ravens. Now, as more and more people have moved to the Mojave Desert area, we're bringing with us, human populations are bringing with us fast food chains and dumpsters and even compost facilities and things that you think of as sort of being beneficial for the ecosystem. These are handouts for ravens. Ravens are smart. They get into the trash, they get into the compost, and their population has ballooned. So there've always been a few desert ravens out in the Mojave area, but like the amount of ravens out there is just astronomically larger than it has been over the last, number of decades. And for the ravens, as Tim says, these tortoises, the baby tortoises are caviar. They're an easy snack. We think of tortoises as being these, armored creatures in these shells, but that really doesn't happen until the tortoises are 5 to 10 years old. So the young juvenile tortoises are just an easy snack for ravens, and they've decimated the population. The population was already in trouble, and the ravens have really taken a major bite, pardon the pun, out of the tortoise population there. So that's the challenge that Tim is dealing with right now. And he felt like the ravens were a place where he could really make a difference. They were a threat that was manageable, unlike something like, say, climate change, where, how much can one person do out there? So he could deal with the ravens, and that's what the film's about.
I was intrigued because of the methods he was using, and like in a raven nest, you see 3, maybe 4 eggs. But when it comes to the desert tortoise, what is the number of eggs from that type of species at one given time? Is it just a couple, or is it 10?
That's a great question. I think there's not that many that come per clutch for a tortoise. And the issue, and it goes to the question you asked about the population and lifespan, is there are plenty of old tortoises that can survive the attack of a raven. Well, the ones that have survived their own pandemic decades ago and just the harsh conditions and more human traffic. But the babies aren't living long enough to actually get to a mature age to reproduce. So I think while a tortoise will lay, a 1 or 2 clutches a season, I believe, not that many of them, if any, make it to maturity.
I noticed that in the documentary, is Tim actually raising the baby desert tortoise? And do they actually, I guess, keep them on hand maybe for 5 to 10 years so the shell is hardened enough to withstand an attack by a raven before they let them off into the wild?
No, that's a great question. Tim himself is not raising baby tortoises, but Tim is partnering with people who are, and that is sort of the vanguard. That's going to be the next iteration of tortoise conservation, is maybe hand raising these tortoises till they're 5 years or even 10 years old, and then releasing them in habitat that's been protected. So I don't think that's happening at scale yet, but if we want to save these creatures, and this, that's all to say too. I think there's some people hear about this kind of stuff and they think, well, like um, we're intervening in nature. We need to let natural courses to happen in their own way, and there's something unnatural about raising tortoises and releasing them in the wild. But like as we mentioned, humans have already intervened in nature in the wrong way. So we've sent things off track. I mean, as nature would have it, we wouldn't have hundreds of thousands of people living out in the Mojave area, but we do. So given that, raising baby tortoises and releasing them into the wild might be the only viable way to sort of deal with this. And of course, some of the things that Tim's doing with the ravens, with the lasers and the tortoiseshells are another approach, and they may need to work together to really save the species.
How long did it take both of you to realize the enormous undertaking that it requires just to save one species?
Pretty quickly, honestly. You get out there, and one of the first things we did with Tim is he took us to a compost facility, and he's like, watch when I get out of my car and raise my arms. And these ravens are so smart that he just puts his arms up in the air and they just instantly take off. They didn't care about us, but they're so smart, they recognized his face. And you just see basically the sky kind of getting blotted out by hundreds, if not thousands of ravens. And it made me reflect, like, how can you even make a dent in something like this?
Well, tell me about the teenager that's also in the film. He seems to be a bit of a genius.
Yeah, Frank Curcio. I don't think he's a teenager anymore, although he was when he started off with Tim. He's still quite young. Yeah, he's a sort of a self-taught engineering whiz. I mean, Tim would, as Tim puts it, like he would go to Frank with ideas. He'd say, "Hey, let's make a laser that can blast green light or red light at birds. Can we make a fake exploding tortoiseshell that's so realistic that it can fool this bird that's basically almost as smart as a person in terms of like identifying what a real or fake tortoiseshell would look like?" And Frank would do it, and he'd figure out how to do it. He'd figure out how to 3D print this stuff. He would iterate over and over and over again. So, Tim's the idea guy. Frank is the, in the lab, in the garage kind of person. And, what was fun about the film was that, it takes that kind of partnership. It's like the classic, James Bond and Q, as they put it, right? Like, or Batman and Alfred, or whoever it was who was making Batman's gizmos. I can't remember. So we kind of leaned into that, but that's really the dynamic that they have, though.
Well, I was intrigued by the film with the fact that how smart the ravens are. They have a memory. They remember things. When it comes to the laser, let's use the green laser for example. I was surprised about that. When they use the green laser to disperse the ravens, do the ravens get to the point of actually remembering the location where the green laser appeared? And do they avoid that area, or do they just keep coming back and you just have to keep firing that laser again?
It's a little bit of both. Tim is just finishing up some pretty big studies that show the number of ravens drops pretty dramatically instantly, and what they do is they fire them a lot right at the beginning, but then later on the ravens learn over time, and they don't just learn from individual experience, they communicate with each other. So that's why Tim says, a live raven is better than a dead raven, because they teach each other. So over time, they have to, do cleanup and fire the laser every now and then just to remind them, but it's nowhere near. They have long memories. And so, yeah, at the beginning they fired a lot, but then the ravens, they, kind of taking advantage of their own intelligence.
The general idea is, like, let's take this high, there's certain super high quality tortoise habitat. And if you can take these areas where the tortoises breed and the babies have the best shot at finding the resources they need, the plants and the water they need to survive, if you can get the ravens to clear out of those areas, you can really let this population bounce back. It's not like you have to get the ravens to leave the entire Mojave Desert. You have to preserve these super important tortoise breeding grounds. And if you can do that, then you can give this species a chance to rebound and rebuild the population.
Well, let's talk about the human element for a moment, because I want to get to the point of what about the exploding tortoiseshell, but the human element. So we have the Mojave Desert. What is, and if the population is moving in, is the Mojave Desert not protected as like a national park, or is it just? And then who actually owns the land so that people can come in or developers can come in and buy it and start expanding a town?
Well, here's the thing. Like, yes, there's plenty of land that's been preserved in the Mojave. Maybe you could argue about whether or not it's been enough, but there is land that's been preserved in the Mojave. But ravens, and there's cities in the Mojave, right? There's areas you can develop, but ravens don't care about the border between a preserved land and a city. They can go. The population can grow because of a nearby city, and they can get up and they can fly over to the national park or the national preserve and prey on tortoises over there. So I think that's the problem. Is like, with an animal like the raven, it doesn't really matter what's been designated, zoned for developing a community and what's been zoned as tortoise habitat. They can seamlessly move in between these spaces, and that's why they've been sort of maybe more of a problematic predator than like a coyote or something like that.
Well, Tim stated that that controlling the raven population as well as their behavior was, like you said earlier, more manageable. But has there been any discussion with those in the area about restricting the use of the desert to humans to also be a manageable threat? I know that with certain areas, it could be New Mexico, Arizona, California, even Utah, where there's so many off-road vehicles that scar the desert for fun, but they're also destroying habitats of various animals and reptiles as well as the vegetation. Has there been any talk about restricting the use of the Mojave Desert by humans to focus on conservation?
Well, that's a very good question, and we didn't really get to that in the in the course of the film. So, like, as far as like land use and the kind of political component of it, political in the sense of how do we zone for this development? Like, we didn't talk a lot about that, but we did. Yes, off-road vehicles are a major problem for tortoises as well. They get run over all the time by people off-roading, and I think there's been a lot of attempts to restrict what areas of the desert you can ride your off-road vehicle in. But, unfortunately, there's people sort of do what they want to do out there. And it's not like there's a lot of law enforcement. So, that's been a persistent issue. But, there's only so much you can do with changing the rules. I'm sure that's something that's sort of an ongoing, I'm sure there's ongoing attempts to protect this land from off-road vehicles. But, I think Tim looked at the landscape of different opportunities to help the tortoise, and he sort of picked the one that he felt like he could have the greatest impact on, as opposed to say, okay, I'm gonna lobby for land use change. I think he probably looked at that and said, what, that's like the bureaucracy and the challenges there are like, I'm not going to get anywhere with that.
Yeah, so. I agree with that. Tell us something about those exploding tortoise shells. What are they actually using in the canisters?
The chemical, I think, is called methylanthranilate, and it's literally grape soda flavoring. And for whatever reason, no one's quite sure, ravens and a lot of other birds just hate the smell of it. So it drives them nuts, and they stay away, like probably even more than the laser, just because of the horrible experience that they're having. So Tim's really trying to create like a patchwork of nightmare experiences out in the desert for them to keep them away from certain areas.
Now, also, too, I noticed that they also created a way to I guess, stop ravens from hatching. What was the process that they were using?
They have, it's called egg oiling. And, if you cover the eggs with oil, a certain kind of oil, the eggs don't hatch. And, what they do is they deploy drones, and they go up and they find the raven's nests, and they can spray oil on the eggs there. And that's it for the clutch, and the adult ravens learn pretty quickly, like when I lay eggs here, they don't hatch into baby ravens, and the ravens will leave ultimately and lay their eggs elsewhere. So that's another way. It's a more, that's sort of ratcheting up the, the battle against the ravens another notch, but that does get them to move and raise chicks elsewhere in a place that's maybe not prime tortoise habitat.
Well, the short film Eco-Hack is so informative. Is there any plans of possibility of seeing Eco-Hack become maybe a series on National Geographic?
We've talked about it, and we've kind of been developing that idea for a while, and just picking a series of scientists that are doing really interesting, innovative things that try and help out a species or an ecosystem. So it's something we're exploring for sure.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of other stories about scientists who are using technology and imagination to do things like this with other species all over the world. So, we would love the opportunity to kind of build this out. These stories need to be told. There's a new field of conservation technology, which is sort of what we're getting at here. It's using technology and invention to save species and biodiversity. And like Eco-Hack this is sort of the first film that we know of about that, but like it certainly shouldn't be the last, and these stories need to be told, and we need to get people excited about getting involved. And for young people who are thinking about engineering, hey, this is a viable career. You can like use your engineering skills to try to save the planet, and that's a fun message that we want to share.
Well, you had the perfect name for a television series. I mean, Eco-Hack, you couldn't have gotten better than that. I can see the ease of promotion and marketing for that. And I could literally, I mean, if it was me, I would be sitting in front of my television waiting for the next episode, because I just love watching things like this. And did you see, as you were working with Tim and filming, did you see even different expansion? Because I learned that with the desert tortoise, because they build those burrows in the desert, that also the Gila monster, the desert roadrunner, and other animals will actually use those burrows themselves, possibly, I guess, to use them as shelter, and possibly after the tortoise has moved out. I mean, there's an expansion from this.
Yeah, in a couple ways. One, Tim is literally expanding his efforts, and he's doing similar things that he's doing with the desert tortoise with other species. So already biologists are calling him and saying, "Hey, I'm trying to save the wood turtle, and I'm not a scientist. I can't tell you where this particular animal lives, but people who are working with other populations are calling Tim and saying, "Hey, what can we do over here with this creature in this environment?" So yeah, like this is what Tim's doing can be applied to other biological problems out there. Secondly, as the ecosystems are an interconnected web of different kinds of creatures, and you can't lose the desert tortoise and not impact other animals in the desert. So, trying to save the desert tortoise isn't just trying to save the desert tortoise; it's trying to preserve all the different animals in the desert, because they all need each other to sustain this intricate ecosystem out there.
Well, when you first started filming with Tim, um, and then I guess it took maybe with it taking over a year filming with Tim, both of you, did you get to see a reduction of the population of the ravens that were attacking the tortoise?
Sorry, your question, did we see any attacks ourselves?
Oh, well, no. Did you see a reduction in the raven population as you had spent over a year filming your documentary with Tim?
Tim's data is a multi-year project, so he is still in the process of collecting a lot of it, and they've gotten grants from the National Science Foundation to keep collecting this data. And furthermore, with I think the Eisenhower Genius Grant they also got, so they are starting to see some preliminary data that's super hopeful, and they're doing small private studies too, like one around a sewage treatment plant, which disgustingly ravens also love. That they're basically able to keep ravens away completely with just a few newer innovations that we didn't cover in the film yet, that they've kind of invented afterwards. So it's incredibly promising in like a small scale, and they're just about to start something that it would be Mojave wide.
I think both of you could probably do a film documentary just on the Raven alone.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Ravens are fascinating, and it's important to convey to people like Tim Shields. He's a fan of ravens. He doesn't hate ravens. He's not trying to take out the raven population. The ravens are smart. They can find their lunch literally anywhere on the planet. They're like people. So, you can get them out of the desert, get them out of the prime tortoise habitat. They're going to be fine. They're going to go somewhere else and they're going to thrive. I can probably walk out my front door right now in Oakland and could point out 20 ravens within 10 feet of my house. So they're really
Well,
cool animals. And I think, I think working on this film kind of, both raised our level of respect for tortoises and for ravens for that matter.
well, I've always been interested in the tortoise for one reason, especially the giant tortoise, because of the fact that it's the perfect species to study the aging process.
Mm.
And uh, I'll put my doctor hat on here for a second. For a lot of people who do not know about the giant tortoise, there's a substance in our body called SOD, which is sodium oxidase dismutase. It is that very nutrient that is found in the giant tortoise. It contains the highest levels of SOD than any species in the whole world. That is the one nutrient they believe that is directly linked to the aging process. So the more you have, the possibility of the longer that you live. So even if it's from the giant tortoise or the desert tortoise, we need to work hard. And I applaud Tim and I applaud both of you for bringing this forward so we can learn more and more on not just saving one species, but saving all species on our planet.
Thank you. Thank you. That's new information to us about the giant tortoise. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I've studied anti-aging my whole career, but for both of you, something even more exciting. What does it mean to the both of you to have the film Eco-Hack be Oscar qualified?
It's really exciting. I think one thing we were trying to do with this film that it seems like it's working, that we're really excited about is, telling stories about things like climate change, especially, are really important to us. But they're often really, and people want to see them, and their stories people want to know, but they're really hard to watch. They're often really depressing and gloomy, and rightfully so. But that can often not be the greatest motivator. So Josh and I, with this film, we're trying to explore a way, like, how can we tell stories about climate change that aren't really depressing and really gloomy? And with this film, we're like, we think we can make this really fun and exciting and really funny, hopefully. And so, at film festivals and things like that, and in audiences we watch it with, it's really been true. Like, people are laughing and they feel kind of relieved to be able to learn about this and see someone doing important work for the environment and be kind of excited and inspired by it.
It is. I mean, and I think you hit the nail on the head here because this is one of the first films that I've seen that was not depressing at all. It was extremely educational. It was informative. For me, and hopefully the audiences around the world are getting interested. They're intrigued. It's a very positive film. Yes, he shows some of the baby tortoises that were attacked by the ravens, or I should say, post mortem. But it wasn't depressing at all. It was actually inspiring to where I wanted the film to actually go longer so I could learn more and more because I just love this kind of stuff.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. And yeah, if we're gonna, I think that's the thinking here is like, if we're gonna try to get people inspired and excited and motivated to go out and try to like save species, save ecosystems, maybe even save the planet, if we can be as bold as to say that, it's going to be through inspiration, through making people feel good and excited and like they can do something and that they can have fun doing it. That's the crazy part. Tim
Yeah.
is having a good time out there in the desert trying to save this animal. He's not walking around depressed, staring at his navel, thinking, "Wow, the world's coming to an end." And I think that's what lets him do what he does. That's his sort of secret sauce, and we want to share that with people and get people kind of thinking along those lines a little bit more.
You know what? Both of you have done something that's very rare when it comes to a documentary about, let's say, saving a species or saving a living thing. I personally get really, really tired of seeing protesters on the news. They're either destroying someone's museum or destroying whatever to get their point across. My thought is instead of complaining or griping, why don't you be part of the actual solution? Tim is part of the solution. Both of you are part of the solution because you're bringing something positive. What attracts people? Positivity attracts people. When we see negativity, that's when people are basically rolling their eyes and walking the other way. So to me, you have brought a perfect formula for all of us to get involved to do something positive for every living thing and our planet.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. I mean, I think, we can't, it's an open question as to the efficacy of the various different forms of trying to deal with this. So, without speaking directly to some of the, protests and all that, because there's a place for them in certain instances. I think for Brett and I, it's more fun for us to make films about the kinds of things that Tim is doing. It's exciting. It makes us feel inspired. And I think that's what we want to do. That's what I'd like to do with my time here is spend it with people who are building solutions and then share those stories out with people and see if we can get other people thinking out of the box and kind of doing similar things. There's a lot of other smart people who are hopefully going to see this film and say, hey, you know what? I got an idea for another problem that nobody could solve. And it's going to take, this machine and this approach or whatever it is. So you never know what's going to happen. And that's a fun place to be.
Well, do either one of you have a particular type of animal or species that you would love to do a documentary about?
That's a great question. God, just thinking about, I just took my young daughter to the zoo the other day, and it's just looking around, just all the animals that I hope will still be around when she's my age. And it kind of makes me really passionate to want to tell stories about a lot of them. So it'd be really hard to pick one. Gorillas and just in their, and monkeys and their, how much they remind us of ourselves, and you can read their emotions on their faces just like you can with other people. I think those would be a lot of fun to spend time with off the top of my head.
And
Yeah.
how about you, Josh?
It's hard to say. I mean, honestly, like the animal is less important to me than the person. I love all animals. There's a lot of animals I'm interested in. I feel lucky to kind of get to spend time out in the wild with any kind of creature. But we'd like to find people who are like Tim, who are out there working with a particular species and passionate about that. And then, that's what the film's about. And then the animal is like, we're going to see the animal through that lens. So if we had set out to just make a nature film about tortoises with voiceover telling us, hey, this tortoise is doing that and this, that, and the other, it just wouldn't have been as fun an experience for us. So we're going to look for that next field biologist who's doing something really innovative, and that's going to be the subject of the next project, or it's going to be Eco-Hack 2, or maybe both. So we'll see.
I like that. I think in the modern era, it can be just called Eco-Hack 2.0.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, again, perfect name. And National Geographic, if you're listening or watching, this needs to be an ongoing weekly series. I can see this thing going in a million different directions and never ending. It's kind of like watching some of the animal shows back in the 1970s and early 80s that were always on Sunday afternoon. And I see Eco-Hack filling that void that we don't get at this moment. But, for both of you, are either one of you working on anything new at the moment that you could share?
Yeah, we are. We're working on a new piece that's very much, it's almost like a sibling film to Eco-Hack, that it's about an entirely different topic, but it's about a team of plant biologists that think they have a really unique way to make plants sequester more carbon in a way that could cut the pace of climate change dramatically. So it's a really, and that's kind of selling it pretty small. It's a really exciting story.
Well, you know what? I think the best, since both of you are in the Bay Area of California, I think one of the best examples of what the difference between normal everyday life versus when everybody was locked down at home was to see the skyline of Los Angeles, California go from smoggy to absolute clarity. And I've even talked to a few people. One was living there for about 5 years, and he said, when during the lockdown, the biggest surprise to me was when I walked out my front door to get the paper, I didn't know there was a mountain range in front of me.
I had that experience when I lived in LA. Actually, I lived there for 6 weeks, I think, before I in Venice. And then one day I went out of my house and I saw the mountain that was down Venice Boulevard. I mean, obviously it was way on the distance, and I didn't know it was there. It was crazy. It was like shocking. I was like, wow, what if you could see this every day?
Well, I think the greatest thing is to, if we could just breathe clean air every day. But both of you have done a stellar job. And my last question to both of you, what has the art of filmmaking taught you about our world?
Well, I can jump in with an idea. I'll let Brett marinate on his in it. But for me, documentary filmmaking specifically, and the way that we've approached it, I know it's a cliche to say, like one person has the power to, affect the world. And I think, right now with as much going on in the world as we see, it's like, it's really hard to believe that. It's like, come on, there's so much going on. How can one person make a difference? That idea has been reaffirmed over and over and over again in the films we've worked on. We've either made projects about one person who has made a major impact, or we've seen that through the process of making the film, you kind of hope that the film's going to get out into the world and affect real change in some capacity. Sometimes that change comes from that one person who sees it, and it makes them say, hey, you know what, I'm going to do this differently. And suddenly it's like the butterfly effect. And, I feel almost cheesy saying it, but like I have literally seen the ramifications of that. So if the filmmaking process has really been a reminder of just the power, you never know what the impact of whatever it is you want to do is going to be. And so it's worth doing. And sometimes it can be a lot bigger than you would have imagined.
Yeah, that's a pretty profound answer. So I'll give something smaller, which is working on documentary has been it's been a really great learning experience just personally, like figuring out more things about how the human brain works, like what Josh was talking about, where a story about a topic about tortoises isn't nearly as interesting to people, to humans, as it is when there's a person that you follow, an interesting character, and when we can attach our empathy to them, and we can get excited about what they're excited about and attach to their passions. So it's really like, from the big to the small, it really feels like there's a lot that learning on an individual basis from person to person that I can learn, but also just so much about humans in general and how we work and how we think, and ways to get stories across to people in ways that matter and is meaningful.
Well, both of you are very powerful filmmakers, and I congratulate you on Eco-Hack. To learn more about Tim Shield's work, go to hardshellslab.com. An Eco-Hack short film documentary is definitely worth every minute, and I personally love the film. We need to learn and understand that what our planet is experiencing and how we can help it in some way. Now, Tim Shield's work expands beyond the tortoise. It actually expands to the Gila monster, the desert roadrunner, the desert owls, as these creatures okay, take two. Take two. 5, 4, 3, 2. To learn more about Tim Shield's work, go to hardshellabs.com. Eco-Hack short film documentary is definitely worth every minute, and I personally love the film. We need to learn and understand that what our planet is experiencing and how we can help it in some way. Now, Tim Shield's work expands beyond the tortoise. It actually expands to the Gila monster, the desert roadrunner, the desert owls, as these creatures will use the burrows of the tortoise for shelter. See, our world is so fascinating, and we need to take more time to experience it. Now, many thanks to Joshua Izenberg and Brett Marty for sharing their incredible short film documentary, Eco-Hack, with us today. And ladies and gentlemen, you can watch the full interview on our various online platforms and on my television show, The Dr. Ward Bond Show, The Ward Bond Show, and please subscribe to our new online show, Bond on Cinema, the perfect place for film lovers to get an in-depth interviews with top film directors, producers, screenwriters, and actors, and even more. And if you love movies, you'll love Bond on Cinema. And as for me, I'll see you next time.